There is a particular quality to silence that only comes after something immense has ended. Not the silence of an empty room or of a forest at night, but the silence that settles over a place that was once, impossibly, alive with a million voices and is now simply not. I have spent a long time thinking about that silence, the silence that fell over Constantinople on the morning of the 29th of May, 1453, when the bells had stopped ringing and the cannons had finally gone quiet, and the greatest city in the medieval world exhaled its last breath as a civilization and became, in the space of a single dawn, something else entirely. Something that could never be called back. I keep returning to one image in particular. It is not a battle scene. It is not a palace, or a fleet, or an emperor on a throne. It is a door. The great bronze doors of the Hagia Sophia, that vast, impossible church that had stood for nearly 1,000 years in the heart of the city, its dome seeming to hang from heaven by a golden chain, its walls sheathed in marble brought from the quarries of Egypt and the hills of Syria, its floor a mosaic of such intricacy that to walk across it was to walk across a field of frozen light. On the night before the final assault, those doors were closed, and behind them, packed shoulder to shoulder, in the candle-lit dark, stood tens of thousands of people. Nobles and servants, monks and merchants, soldiers who had come to pray before returning to the walls to die. They were Greeks and Genoese and Venetians and Armenians and Catalans. They were Orthodox Christians who had spent the better part of a century arguing bitterly with one another about the finer points of theology, about the nature of the Holy Spirit, about the authority of the Pope, about whether the bread used in communion should be leavened or unleavened. Arguments that had fractured the Christian world and cost Byzantium the Western support it desperately needed. But on that night, none of that mattered. On that night they were simply human beings standing together in the dark, listening to the sound of the Ottoman drums rolling across the water, and knowing, with a clarity that must have been almost peaceful, that the morning would decide everything. What happened in that city, what was lost and what was transformed and what endures, is one of the great stories of human civilization. It is a story about the fragility of the world we build, and about the extraordinary persistence of memory, and about the way that endings, when they come, rarely announce themselves as such. The people inside those bronze doors did not know they were living the last hours of an empire that had lasted, in one form or another, for over 1,100 years. They thought they were waiting for a terrible battle. They did not know they were waiting for the end of the ancient world. I want to take you there, not to the fall itself. We will get to that. We will follow it moment by moment through the darkness. But first to the city as it was, to the Constantinople that existed before the cannons of Mehmed II began their work. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was there. And what was there, for most of its long history, was nothing less than the most magnificent city on the face of the earth. You have to begin with the geography, because the geography is everything. Constantinople sits on a narrow triangle of land where Europe reaches out toward Asia, across a stretch of deep blue water. And the world, the grain of the Black Sea, the silk of the East, the gold of the Mediterranean, is forced to pass through its hands. The city occupies a promontory, a tongue of land bounded on its southern side by the Sea of Marmara, on its northeastern side by a long curved inlet of dazzling sheltered water that the Greeks called the Golden Horn, and connected to the rest of Europe by a narrow neck of land to the west. From certain vantage points, the city seems to float, suspended between two continents, between two seas, between two worlds. The light on the water around it shifts with the time of day in ways that still astonish visitors. In the early morning, the Golden Horn catches the sunrise, and the water turns a colour that has no precise name in English, something between copper and rose and gold, and the domes and minarets of the skyline rise out of this luminous haze, like a vision constructed from light rather than from stone. Whatever the hour, whatever the century, whatever the political circumstances of the particular moment, the view from those straits has always carried a quality of the absolute, of the inevitable, of a place that exists not merely because human beings decided to build there, but because the world required it. It was, from the moment the Roman Emperor Constantine chose it in the year 330 as the new capital of his empire, almost impossibly well situated. It could be defended, it could be fed, and above all, it could grow rich. because every ship that passed between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had no choice but to sail directly beneath its walls. The tolls collected on that traffic, century after century, were the foundation of everything that came after. Wealth and power and beauty and scholarship, all of it resting, at its base, on the simple geographic fact that there was only one way through, and Constantinople stood beside it. Constantine called it Nova Roma, New Rome. He intended it as a second capital for his vast empire, a counterweight to the aging city on the Tiber. He laid it out with the conscious ambition of a man who understood that he was building something meant to last. He brought marble and columns from the old temples of the pagan world, stripping the sacred sites of the ancient Mediterranean to furnish the new capital of a new faith. Columns from Athens, marble from Egypt, bronzes from Antioch, statues from the sanctuaries of a world that was passing. It was an act of both destruction and preservation, destroying the pagan contexts to preserve the pagan objects, as if even in the founding of a Christian empire the old beauty could not quite be discarded. He installed a new senate, a new forum, a hippodrome that could seat 100,000 people, a hippodrome modelled on the Circus Maximus of Rome, where the chariot races that kept the Roman population entertained and politically pacified could be staged with suitable magnificence. The hippodrome was the heartbeat of the city in those early centuries, the place where the pulse of the population was most clearly felt, where the competing factions of the blues and the greens, chariot racing teams that functioned also as political parties, and street gangs and theological pressure groups expressed the city's tensions and occasionally exploded into violence that shook the throne itself. The Nika riots of 532, when half the city burned and 30,000 people died, and Justinian nearly fled before his Empress Theodora shamed him into staying, began in the hippodrome. The hippodrome was where the city loved itself and hated itself and tested the limits of what it could endure. He placed at the centre of this hippodrome a bronze column, 3 intertwined serpents, looted from the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, where it had stood for 9 centuries to commemorate the Greek victory over the Persians at Plataea. The serpent column still stands in Istanbul today, worn and broken, shorter than it once was, the serpent heads long since lost, but still there, still rooted in the same earth where Constantine planted it 1700 years ago. I find something almost unbearable in that fact. The same object in the same place across the full span of recorded history. A bronze thread connecting our world to the world of ancient Greece, running unbroken through the heart of what was once the greatest city on earth. When I stand beside it, and I have stood beside it, on a cold morning, with the city waking up around me, and the minarets of the blue mosque catching the first light above the roofline, I feel something that I cannot fully name, the weight of accumulated time, the vertigo of realizing that the same object was looked at by Athenians who had fought at Plataea, and by Constantine, and by Justinian, and by the last emperor as he rode through his city to say goodbye to it, and by Mehmed as he surveyed the wreckage of his victory, and now by me, and now, in a sense, by anyone who thinks about it. There is no distance. The bronze is the same bronze. The serpents, or what remains of them, are the same serpents. Time, which we think of as a river carrying things away, has also, in its strange way, kept this. The city that grew up around these foundations over the following centuries was not simply a political capital. It was the keeper of the ancient world. When the western half of the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, swallowed by the migrations and invasions that we have come to call, in our shorthand, the fall of Rome, Constantinople held. While the libraries of the West were burned, and the aqueducts ran dry, and the marble cities of Gaul and Spain became quarries for peasant huts, while the roads fell into disrepair, and the long-distance trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world contracted and finally broke, the imperial city on the Bosphorus kept the lights burning. The Greek philosophers were read there, the Roman legal codes were preserved and refined there, reaching their definitive form in the great codification commissioned by Justinian in the 6th century, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, which would eventually become the foundation of legal systems across the Western world. The art of mosaic, of silk weaving, of enamelling metal with fields of translucent colour, of producing manuscripts that were themselves works of art, all of this survived in Constantinople when it had been extinguished almost everywhere else. The scholar Michael Psellus writing in the 11th century, could still read Plato in the original Greek and engage with him as a living intellectual presence, not a dusty relic. The historian Anna Comnene, daughter of an emperor, wrote a biography of her father in the 12th century, the Alexiad, that is one of the masterworks of medieval literature, a work of psychological acuity and narrative sophistication that has almost no parallel in the Western Europe of its time, where literate women, let alone women who wrote military and political history with the authority and skill of Anna Comnene, were essentially unknown. These were not the products of a civilization in decline. These were the products of a civilization that had never stopped believing in itself and the city itself. What a thing it was. At its peak, in the 6th century, under the Emperor Justinian, Constantinople may have held 500,000 people, the largest city in the Western world by an order of magnitude, at a time when the largest city in England held perhaps 10,000 and the largest city in France perhaps 15. It was a city of fountains and forums, of covered markets where silk and spices from the east were sold beside wheat from the Black Sea coast, of bathhouses that still functioned in the Roman manner, vast heated halls where men and women came to bathe and converse and conduct business, just as their Roman ancestors had done. Of churches, dozens, then hundreds of churches, rising above the roofline of the city, like a second city of stone and gold, built on top of the first. The Patriarch of Constantinople presided over a church that saw itself as the rightful centre of all Christian worship. The emperor, draped in silk dyed with Tyrian purple, the most expensive substance in the ancient world, made from the crushed bodies of sea snails and worth more than gold by weight, seated on a throne flanked by mechanical golden lions that roared and mechanical golden birds that sang when he received foreign ambassadors, was not merely a political ruler. He was, in the theology of the Byzantine state, God's vicar on earth. The 13th apostle, the equal of the apostles, the living embodiment of a divine and eternal order that stretched from the throne in Constantinople up through the celestial hierarchy to the throne of God himself. The ceremonial of the Byzantine court was an art form of almost unimaginable elaborateness. Everything had a prescribed form, a precise liturgy, the colours an official could wear, the number of steps with which he could approach the emperor, the exact formula of the words with which he had to address him. All of this was encoded in manuals, revised and elaborated across the centuries, kept as carefully as scripture. The court of Constantinople was a theatre in which the eternal order of the universe was acted out every day in the movements of silk-clad officials through marble halls. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed it were overwhelmed. An ambassador from the West, used to the comparatively rough informality of a feudal court, would arrive in Constantinople and find himself in a world so polished, so layered with accumulated meaning and ceremony, that it must have felt like entering a different order of reality entirely. At the heart of all of this, the spiritual and physical centre of gravity around which the entire city organised itself, stood the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. The Emperor Justinian began its construction in 532 on the site of an earlier church that had burned in a riot. He assembled the greatest mathematicians and engineers of his age, Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Trelles, men who approached the problem of covering an enormous space with a dome, not as a matter of mere engineering, but as a problem of theology made manifest in stone. The dome they designed was revolutionary, not a solid half-sphere resting on walls, as in the Pantheon in Rome, but a floating structure, pierced at its base by 40 windows arranged in a ring, so that from below the dome appeared to rest on nothing at all, to hover in the air, to hang, as the historian Procopius wrote in the 6th century, suspended from heaven by a golden chain. The natural light that fell through those 40 windows diffused as it descended and caught the gold of the mosaics on the walls and the floor, creating an interior atmosphere of luminous, shifting gold. Not the static gold of a painting, but the living, breathing gold of light itself, moving as the sun moved outside, transforming the interior of the building, hour by hour, into something that seemed less like a constructed space and more like a natural phenomenon, like standing inside a cloud at sunset. When Justinian entered the completed church in 537, he is said to have spread his arms and cried out, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." There is no particular reason to doubt that he said this. Standing under that dome, with the light pouring through those windows and washing over the gold mosaics and the great figures of saints and emperors worked in coloured stone across the walls and galleries, with the space above so vast and so suffused with light that the ceiling seemed genuinely far away, genuinely celestial, genuinely not of this world, it was perhaps the only natural thing to say. The church became, over the centuries, more than a building. It became an idea. The idea that in Constantinople, the meeting of heaven and earth was not a metaphor, but an architectural fact. That the boundary between the human and the divine was thin here, thinner than anywhere else, made permeable by the particular quality of the light and the stone and the gold. Pilgrims came from across the Christian world and stood beneath that impossible dome and felt, some of them, that they had arrived at the centre of the universe. Not the geographic centre, they were not confused about that, but the spiritual centre, the axis around which the meaning of things turned. This is not an easy feeling to describe to someone who has not had it, and I am not sure I can fully describe it even having stood in that space myself, in the particular hush that the building produces even now, when it is a mosque, and the acoustic is somewhat altered by the carpets and the lack of echo from the old stone floor. There is still something, there is still a quality of the space that resists ordinary language and ordinary experience. Something that the engineers of the 6th century built into it deliberately, or that accreted there over the centuries of prayer and ceremony, or simply that the mathematics of the dome produces in the human nervous system, some combination of scale and light and proportion that quiets the mind and opens some chamber of the self that daily life usually keeps closed. The great Russian chronicle tells of how the envoys sent by Prince Vladimir of Kiev in 987 to investigate the religions of the world came to the Hagia Sophia and witnessed the liturgy being sung, the great Byzantine liturgy, with its clouds of incense and its gold vestments and its choirs that seemed to fill the air with sound from every direction simultaneously, and reported back to their prince, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for surely there is no such splendour or beauty anywhere on earth. We cannot describe it to you, only this we know, that God dwells there among men." That report, the story goes, was part of what led Vladimir to choose Orthodox Christianity for his people. A dome, a building, light through windows arranged in a ring, and the course of Russian history was changed. Think about what that means. The architecture of a single building, the decision by two engineers in the 6th century to make a dome that appeared to float, helped determine the religious identity of the largest nation on earth. This is what it means for a building to matter. This is what it means for a city to matter. Cities are not just places where things happen. They are the conditions under which certain things become possible and other things become impossible. Certain thoughts, certain feelings, certain ways of understanding who we are and what we owe each other and what, if anything, lies beyond the visible world. Constantinople made certain things possible for 1100 years. What those things were, exactly, we are still trying to understand, because we lost them before we fully understood them. But history has a way of not caring what a city is worth. The story of Constantinople is not simply a story of greatness, it is a story of great greatness and great fragility, and of the long, slow grinding of one against the other across 11 centuries, until one morning in May, the fragility finally won. The wounds came from many directions and across many generations. The city had survived sieges before. It had survived the Avars and the Arabs, the Bulgarians and the Rus. It had survived plagues and fires and the dynastic crises that periodically tore the imperial family apart, the blinding of emperors, the murder of heirs, the coups and counter-coups that ran like a dark current beneath the glittering surface of Byzantine court life. The walls had held. God had not let it fall. The argument had evidence on its side. In the year 1204, it was not the Ottomans or any Eastern power that dealt the most devastating blow to Byzantine civilization. It was the Christians of the West. The Fourth Crusade, that deeply strange and morally catastrophic military enterprise, had been assembled with the intention of recapturing Jerusalem from the Muslims who had held it since Saladin's victory in 1187. Instead, diverted by Venetian commercial interests, by debts the Crusaders could not pay, and by the chaotic politics of various claimants to the Byzantine throne, the army turned against Constantinople itself, The city that had stood for 9 centuries was sacked by a Latin Christian army that tore down bronze statues for their metal, hacked apart jewelled reliquaries for their gems, used the altar cloths of the Hagia Sophia as horse blankets and the communion vessels as drinking cups, that loaded the art and treasure of a civilization onto ships and carried it to Venice and Rome and Paris, where much of it can still be seen today in the collections of museums and churches. What they could not carry, they burned. The fires burned for days. Chroniclers on both sides recorded the devastation with a kind of stunned grief. The Byzantine scholar Nikitas Choniates, who had been inside the city and barely escaped, wrote an account of the sack that is one of the most heartbreaking documents in medieval literature. He wrote that even the Saracens, even the Muslim enemies of Christendom, would have been more merciful than these so-called defenders of the faith. He wrote about statues of ancient beauty that had been in Constantinople since Constantine's time, melted down for the copper in their bodies. He wrote about the libraries, those extraordinary, irreplaceable repositories of ancient knowledge, texts that had survived the fall of the Western Empire, texts that no longer existed anywhere else in the world, the accumulated intellectual heritage of Greece and Rome, in the language in which it had been written, stored carefully in the cool dark of rooms that the scholars of the city had tended for centuries. Many of those manuscripts burned in the fires of 1200 and Tohoned. We will never know what we lost. You cannot make a list of the things that no longer exist, because the only copy of their existence was destroyed. They are simply gone, and the gaps they left in human knowledge are invisible to us because we do not know what shape they had. The city was eventually retaken by the Byzantines in 1261, but it never really recovered. The empire that emerged from the Latin occupation was a shadow of the one that had preceded it, smaller, poorer, and structurally weakened in ways that would prove fatal over the following 2 centuries. The great economic networks that had made Constantinople rich were now controlled by the Genoese and the Venetians, who extracted their profits from the city's trade through treaties that gave them privileges the Byzantine merchants themselves did not enjoy. The imperial territory shrank. Province by province, the land that had once stretched from Italy to Mesopotamia contracted, under pressure from the rising power of the Ottoman Turks in the east and the political fragmentation of the Balkans to the west, until by the early 15th century the Byzantine Empire consisted, in practical terms, of little more than the city itself, a few islands in the Aegean, and a small enclave in the southern Greek peninsula called the Morea. An empire that had once commanded 1,000 miles of coastline now commanded a promontory, a city, a memory of itself. There is something both tragic and deeply human about this kind of decline, the kind that is slow enough that each generation can tell itself it is not in decline, that the current contraction is temporary, that the walls still hold, that God has not yet abandoned the city. Each emperor in the late Byzantine period made his calculations and found reasons for hope. There were diplomatic initiatives, there were appeals to the West, there were theological negotiations, agonizing, humiliating negotiations about the submission of the Orthodox Church to Rome, negotiations that split the Byzantine intelligentsia and the church hierarchy into bitter factions, each accusatory toward the other, each certain that the wrong choice would doom the city. The city was torn, in its last centuries, between those who believed that union with Rome and Western military support was the only path to survival, and those who believed that union with Rome was a betrayal of everything the city stood for and that God would provide if the faith was kept pure. This argument had no resolution because both sides were, in different ways, right. Western military support might have saved the city, and the cost of obtaining it might have destroyed what the city was. Some dilemmas have no good exits, and yet, the city endured. It endured because the walls held, the great Theodosian walls, built in the early 5th century under the Emperor Theodosius II, and never since seriously breached from the landward side, were one of the wonders of the medieval military world. They stretched for nearly 4 miles across the neck of the peninsula, a system of triple fortifications, a deep outer ditch that could be flooded with water, a low outer wall with its own towers, an inner wall nearly 15 feet thick and 40 feet high, punctuated by towers that rose even higher, and behind all of that, a massive interior wall of such depth and solidity that it would have seemed, to anyone looking at it, simply invulnerable. This was not a single wall, but an entire system, layered, redundant, designed so that even if one line was breached, the next could be held. It had been added to and repaired and improved across the centuries, so that the fabric of the walls at any given point represented the accumulated defensive ingenuity of a dozen generations of Byzantine engineers. The walls were not simply fortifications, they were a kind of theological argument. The city inside them was protected by God, because it contained the relics of God's saints, because it was the seat of the true faith, because the dome of the Hagia Sophia hung from heaven by that golden chain, and God would not let it fall. This was not naivety. For 1,000 years, it had been demonstrably true. The Avars had failed against these walls. The Arabs had failed against them, twice, in great sieges that the Byzantines regarded as miraculous deliverances, the hand of God made visible in history. The Rus had failed. Even the fierce and brilliant armies of the Hunnic Empire had turned away without attempting a serious assault. The walls had held. God had not let it fall. The argument had evidence on its side, but faith and walls are only as strong as the human beings behind them. And by the spring of 1453, the human beings behind the walls of Constantinople were very few. The last emperor of Byzantium was Constantine Paleologos. He had come to the throne in 1449, under circumstances that anyone paying attention could not help but see as darkly ironic. He was crowned not in Constantinople, where the proper ceremonies could not be afforded, and the political situation was too complicated for the usual rituals, but in Mistra, in the Morea, in a ceremony of reduced magnificence for a reduced empire. He was in his mid-40s, a soldier by instinct and by long experience. He had spent years governing the Peloponnese, and had conducted himself well in difficult military situations, without the elaborate political gifts of some of his predecessors, but with something perhaps more valuable in the circumstances he found himself in, a clarity of purpose and an absence of self-deception. He knew what was coming. He had watched the Ottoman advance across the Balkans with the clear eyes of a man who had spent his life measuring military realities and was not in the habit of mistaking hope for assessment. He appealed to the West. He negotiated with the Church. He put the defences of the city in order as best he could with what he had. But he did not deceive himself about the odds. Mehmed II had become Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in 1451, at the age of 19. He was not the first Ottoman Sultan to turn his attention toward Constantinople. His great-grandfather Bayezid had besieged it in the 1390s, and his father Murad had laid siege to it in the 1420s. But he was the first to combine the military resources, the strategic vision, the logistical capacity, and the personal obsession necessary to actually accomplish the thing. Mehmed had grown up with the fall of Constantinople as a kind of personal destiny, a fixed point toward which everything in his life was directed. He studied maps of the city in his private chambers. He memorized the layout of its walls, its harbours, its gates, its weak points. He read the ancient accounts of previous sieges and studied why they had failed, not as historical curiosity, but as operational intelligence, as the systematic investigation of a problem he intended to solve. He commissioned translations of classical texts. He spoke 6 languages: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Serbian. He read and discussed philosophy. He had studied the histories of Alexander and Julius Caesar with the attention of a student learning from predecessors, rather than the attention of a ruler collecting trophies. He was, in the words of the Greek scholar George Francis, who knew him personally and wrote about him with a mixture of awe and something very close to terror, a man of frightening intelligence and relentless will. He was 21 years old when the siege began. In the autumn of 1451, Mehmed made a move that Constantine had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. He began construction of a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, at the narrowest point of the strait, a point where the water is barely half a mile wide, directly across from an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian shore. The new fortress was built with terrifying speed, rising from nothing to completion in less than 4 months, a feat of organisation and logistical will that demonstrated clearly the kind of opponent Constantinople was facing. Mehmed named it Boghaz Kesin, the throat cutter, and the name was accurate in every sense. With 2 fortresses controlling the Bosphorus, the strait could be blockaded. Ships attempting to pass without permission could be fired on. The supply routes from the grain-rich shores of the Black Sea could be cut at will. The city could be isolated. The city could be starved. The city could be made to understand, before the first shot was fired from the great cannon, that it was already surrounded, that the world outside its walls had already been organized against it. Constantine sent envoys to protest the construction of the fortress. The envoys were arrested. He sent gifts and diplomatic letters to the new sultan. The letters were not answered, or were answered with courtesies that concealed nothing. He sent word throughout the Christian West, appealing for help, for ships, for soldiers, for mercenaries, for anything that could arrive in time and in sufficient quantity to make a difference. The response was, and I choose the word carefully because I think it is the only honest one, shameful. The Pope, Nicholas V, offered to organize a crusade if the Greek Church would formally submit to the authority of Rome, a condition that was politically impossible for Constantine to accept, given the depth of feeling on the issue among his own clergy and people. The Italian city-states sent polite regrets and continued calculating their commercial interests in the Ottoman world. The King of France, the Holy Roman Emperor, the rulers of Spain and England and Hungary, all of them found reasons, some more plausible than others, why they could not send armies to the defense of a city that had held the eastern frontier of Christendom for 1,000 years. A city that had absorbed blow after blow from the east so that the west could grow and prosper behind its walls, undisturbed by the storms that broke on its battlements. 2 Venetian ships, eventually slipped through the Ottoman fleet to bring a handful of Venetian soldiers. A Genoese soldier of fortune named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo arrived with 700 men, and his presence was so welcome, so desperately needed, that Constantine immediately gave him command of the defence of the entire land wall. 700 men for 4 miles of wall, against what was coming. What was coming was, by the standards of the medieval world, almost incomprehensible. It was something that had no precedent, that broke the categories within which medieval military planning operated. Mehebet assembled an army of extraordinary size. The estimates in the sources vary enormously, and the true number is impossible to know with precision. But a figure somewhere between 80,000 and 140,000 fighting men is probably in the right range, supported by a fleet of over 100 ships. This was not unusual for a major Ottoman campaign. What was unusual, what was genuinely new in the history of warfare, was what Meheb brought to bear on the walls. The cannon had been designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had first approached Constantine with his invention and offered his services. Constantine had told him, truthfully, that he could not afford to pay what Orban was asking. Orban had then gone to Mehmed, who paid without hesitation and commissioned not one cannon, but a battery of them, including a monster that would become, in the imagination of the defenders on the walls, something almost supernatural. Its barrel was 27 feet long. It could hurl a stone ball weighing over 1,500 pounds, the weight of a large horse, a distance of more than a mile. When this cannon was first tested near the Ottoman capital of Edirne, the sound of its firing was heard at a distance of 12 miles. The ground shook beneath the crew that loaded and aimed it. The ball, when it struck the earth, buried itself 6 feet deep in the soil. This was a new kind of war. The defenders of Constantinople had, when the siege formally began on the 6th of April, 1453, approximately 7,000 fighting men, Greeks, Genoese, Venetians, Catalans, and a handful of others who had come for various reasons of honour or commerce or adventure. The city's population, which had once been numbered in the hundreds of thousands, had shrunk to perhaps 40 or 50,000 by this time, a consequence of the plagues that had swept through the city repeatedly in the preceding century, of the economic decay that had emptied the wealthiest neighbourhoods, and of the simple psychological erosion of living inside walls that enclosed more space than the people within them could fill. There were ruins inside Constantinople in 1453. Entire neighbourhoods that had once been dense with housing now held only the foundations of buildings long since collapsed, and gardens that had grown up wild in the empty lots where houses had stood, and orchards that had once been tended and were now going to seed. The empire had become a ghost of itself, haunting its own magnificent shell. The city was a beautiful, hollow monument to everything it had once been, but even then, even with all of this, even knowing the disparity, 7,000 against 100,000, cannon against walls, the enormous logistical machine of the Ottoman military against the threadbare resources of a city that had been running out of everything for a generation. Even with all of this, Constantinople held for 53 days. The defence was organised primarily along the land walls, where the Ottoman army pressed its main assault. Giustiniani was the central figure in this defence, a professional soldier of considerable competence and calm under pressure, the kind of man whose presence has a steadying effect on the people around him. He placed his Genoese and other Western soldiers at the most vulnerable sections, particularly at the lowest point of the fortifications in the valley of the Lycus River, where the land dipped and the walls dipped with it, creating a slight topographical weakness that Mehmed's engineers had identified and that the great cannon targeted from the very first day of the siege. The cannon was positioned on a rise to the west, aiming directly at that section, and every morning it fired. Not constantly. The barrel of bronze had to cool between shots. The enormous powder charges took time to prepare, and the carriage that supported the gun had to be repeatedly realigned as the recoil shifted it, but with a methodical, implacable regularity. Each shot a geological event. The stone balls struck the outer wall, and the wall crumbled, not all at once but in stages, each impact displacing stones that had been mortared together for centuries, opening cracks that subsequent shots widened into gaps, and the gaps into breaches, the mortar dust rising in great slow clouds, the thunder of each impact rolling across the water of the Golden Horn, to where the Genoese merchants of Galata, who had declared neutrality and refused to participate in the defence, were watching from safety behind their own walls. And every night, the defenders went back to the breaches and filled them. They worked in torchlight, dragging timber and rubble, and earth and barrels of soil to plug the gaps before morning. It was desperate, exhausting work, the work of men who had spent the day fighting and were now spending the night building, sleeping a few hours before dawn and then returning to the walls to fight again. They ate what the city could produce, which was not much. The harvests from the gardens inside the walls were sparse. The supplies from outside had been cut off for weeks. The soldiers lived on inadequate rations and continued anyway because there was nothing else to do. You hold what you hold, you fill the breach, you get up the next morning and hold it again. Constantine moved along the walls constantly, by day and by night. He slept little and ate less than his soldiers. George Francis, his personal secretary, his companion, perhaps his closest friend in those final weeks, records the emperor's movements with a kind of loving precision. At this gate, at that tower, here conferring with Giustiniani, they're encouraging a group of Greek soldiers who were flagging. They're praying in the small chapel at the Blackenay Palace that served as his personal oratory. He was everywhere that was needed and nowhere that was comfortable. He had been offered the possibility of escape more than once. Mehmed had sent messengers offering terms of surrender. Give up the city, leave with your life, keep your personal fortune, go into exile wherever you chose. Other examples existed of Byzantine emperors who had done exactly this, negotiated their personal survival at the cost of their throne, and history had not always judged them harshly. The circumstances sometimes permitted no better option, but Constantine's answers, each time, were variations on the same refusal. He was the emperor. The city was the empire. To give up one was to give up the other. There was nothing left to bargain with. There were moments of genuine hope in those 53 days. Moments when the defence seemed almost sustainable, when the tenacity of the garrison appeared capable of outlasting the Ottoman army's willingness to absorb casualties. In mid-April, a small fleet of Genoese supply ships managed to break through the Ottoman naval blockade in a running battle that the entire population of the city turned out to watch from the walls and the towers, screaming, praying, weeping, clutching one another as the heavy-hulled merchant ships, propelled by a favourable wind from the southwest, smashed through the lighter Ottoman galleys that tried to intercept them. The Ottoman fleet had been unable to stop them. The relief in the city when those ships made it through and their ropes were thrown to the docks in the Golden Horn was enormous. A collective emotional release, a shared exhalation, of the kind that only comes from a population that has been holding its breath for weeks and is finally, briefly, permitted to breathe. In late April, Mehmed made a move that has gone down in military history as one of the most audacious logistical operations of the medieval world, and one that changed the psychological balance of the siege in a single night. The Golden Horn, the sheltered inlet along the city's northern side, was protected by a massive chain stretched across its mouth that prevented enemy ships from entering. Mehmed's engineers laid down a road of greased logs across the hills on the Galata side of the inlet. In a single night, in extraordinary silence and with extraordinary organisation, they dragged 70 ships overland on those logs, across the hills that separated the Bosphorus from the upper reaches of the Golden Horn, and lowered them into the inlet behind the chain. When dawn came, the defenders on the northern walls looked out and saw an Ottoman fleet, where the night before there had been nothing but open water and the certainty of safety. The psychological shock was immense, sudden and total. It meant the city was now threatened from a direction that had previously seemed secure. It meant that this man, this 21-year-old sultan in his tent on the hills, was capable of imagining things that no one else had imagined, and then simply making them real through the application of will and organisation. The impossible, it turned out, was a category that applied to other people. The days of May accumulated. The cannon fired, and the walls crumbled, and the defenders repaired them. The Ottoman army probed at different sections, testing for weaknesses, and each time was driven back, at considerable cost to both sides, but at cost the Ottomans could absorb, and the defenders could not. The garrison was shrinking, slowly but steadily, through wounds and death, and the accumulation of exhaustion that wears a man down past the point of being able to fully function. The city was running short of arrows, of powder, of the timber needed to build the temporary fortifications that plugged the breaches. The food situation was deteriorating. There was hunger in Constantinople, not starvation, not yet, but the kind of persistent, grinding, underfed quality that makes everything harder, that makes the muscles ache and the mind fog and the spirit require a more conscious effort to maintain. Inside the city, during those weeks, life maintained a strange, suspended quality. The liturgical calendar continued. The churches held their services on their appointed days because the rhythm of religious observance is one of the last things to stop, even under siege. Perhaps because it is precisely under siege that it matters most. The structure of meaning, the architecture of the sacred, holding the shape of a community, even as the physical walls around that community crumble under cannon fire. The markets continued to function, diminished and anxious but operating, because people still needed to eat, and the habits of daily commerce are almost impossible to fully extinguish. There were children in Constantinople in the spring of 1453, children who had been born inside those walls and had never seen the world outside them, who were growing up to the sound of distant cannon fire as a kind of permanent feature of the landscape, the way other children might grow up to the sound of the sea. A monk named Gennadius continued to write theological treatises in his cell, because the intellectual life does not pause even when the political life is in extremis. A Venetian ship's captain named Giacomo Barbaro kept a careful daily log of the siege's progress, recording weather, military events, and the daily state of the harbour with the cool professionalism of a man who had spent his life measuring the world in cargo manifests and sailing schedules, and whose log survives and remains one of the most vivid primary sources for the events of those weeks. And then came the night of the 22nd of May. There was a lunar eclipse, total, long, turning the full moon above the city a deep and terrible red, the colour of old blood, the colour of fire viewed through smoke. For a people who read the sky for signs, for whom the movements of the heavenly bodies were messages written by God in the language of light, this was catastrophic, not merely frightening, but theologically devastating. There was an ancient prophecy, passed down through the centuries with the weight of received wisdom, that Constantinople would never fall while the moon was full. The moon was full, and it was drowning in blood-coloured shadow, as if the light of God was being withdrawn from the city, even as they watched. Monks who had been praying steadily through the siege, men of iron faith who had kept their composure through weeks of cannon fire and dwindling supplies, now wept openly in the streets. The religious panic spread through the exhausted and frightened population with the speed of fire through dry wood. Processions formed spontaneously, carrying icons through the streets, calling on God and the Virgin to intervene, to send the Western ships that had not come, to do something, anything, that would indicate that the city had not been abandoned by the divine protection that had sheltered it for 1,000 years. 3 days later, a heavy fog settled over Constantinople. Unusual for that time of year, eerie in its density, muffling the sounds of the Ottoman camp and filling the streets with a disorienting, cottony silence. Some of the defenders saw it as a sign of divine protection, the city hidden by God's mercy. Others, more darkly, remembered a prophecy that the glory of God had departed the city, wrapped in a cloud. Mehmed, watching from his tent, understood what these omens were doing to the people behind the walls. He pressed his advantage. The final assault was scheduled for the night of the 28th of May into the early hours of the 29th. That afternoon, the afternoon of the 28th, the last full day of the Byzantine Empire, Constantine did something that has struck every historian who has written about these events as deeply, profoundly, and almost unbearably human. He called together his council, his advisors, his senior commanders, Greek and Genoese and Venetian, all of them, and he addressed them. Francis was there. The speech has been preserved or reconstructed in several sources, and while the exact words differ between accounts, the essential content is consistent. He thanked them. He acknowledged what they had endured. He spoke about what they were defending, not merely a city, but a civilization, a continuity, a way of understanding the world that had been sustained in this place for 1100 years. He asked them, if they chose to fight on, to do so not for him personally, but for their faith and for their families and for the idea that some things are worth the cost of defending. He wept. Several of those present wept. Men who had spent weeks fighting with swords and arrows in their bare hands, who had patched breaches in ancient walls by torchlight, who had watched friends and comrades die around them, stood in a room with their emperor and wept. Then Constantine did one more thing. He rode through the city, not inspecting the defences, not issuing final orders, simply riding, slowly, through the streets of Constantinople in the afternoon light. Francis rode with him. He passed the churches and the covered markets, past the ruins of neighbourhoods that had been emptying for a generation, past the wild gardens that had grown up where houses once stood, past the hippodrome where the serpent column from Delphi still rose from its ancient socket in the earth. He passed the Hagia Sophia, and its dome was still above him, still impossibly there, still seeming to hang from the sky. He was saying goodbye to the city. He was letting it say goodbye to him. He was doing what the last moment before an ending always requires, if we have the grace and the presence of mind to do it. He was paying attention. He was here, fully, in this place, in this light, with this city around him, before it became memory. In the evening, there was a ceremony in the Hagia Sophia. One last ceremony, one last gathering, one last liturgy under that dome. The emperor came with his court. The soldiers came, the Genoese and the Venetians, the Greeks, the Catalans, men who had spent weeks fighting alongside each other, and who still, in another context, represented nations and interests in frequent conflict. The priests and monks came. The ordinary citizens crowded in behind them, pressing into every corner of that vast interior until the church held as many people as it could hold, standing in the candlelight beneath the gold mosaics and the dome that hung above them all. The Greek liturgy was sung, and then, at the request of the Latin soldiers present, it was sung again in Latin. For the first and only time in the history of that building, the two versions of the Christian faith that had been at theological war for centuries sang together in the same space, their voices rising together into the same dome, because what was coming in the morning made the differences between them, which had seemed for so long to matter so enormously, feel suddenly very small. The Emperor of Byzantium, Constantine Palaiologos, the last in an unbroken line of Roman emperors stretching back 1200 years to Augustus Caesar, received communion in the Hagia Sophia on the evening of the 28th of May, 1453. He then went out into the night, mounted his horse at the door of the great church, and rode to the walls. The Ottoman attack came in the darkest hours before dawn, in 3 successive waves of escalating ferocity. The first wave was composed of the Bashi bazouks, irregular troops, the most expendable soldiers in the Ottoman army, thrown at the walls first, not because Mehmed expected them to breach the defences, but because they would exhaust the garrison, use up the defenders' ammunition and energy, and if they died in large numbers, that was of no particular military consequence to an army of such size. They came screaming, with ladders and torches, and they struck the walls at multiple points simultaneously. And the defenders who had not slept properly in days, and who had been filling breaches by torchlight the night before, now fought them off in the dark, cutting down the scaling ladders, pouring boiling water and oil from the towers, fighting with arrows and bolts and stones, and when those ran low, with whatever came to hand. The first wave lasted perhaps 2 hours. It receded, leaving its dead below the walls, and leaving the defenders more exhausted than before. The second wave was Anatolian troops, more disciplined, more ferocious, fighting with the combination of professional skill and genuine religious conviction that made the Ottoman army so formidable. They came with grappling hooks and ropes as well as ladders, attempting to scale the walls at multiple points simultaneously, keeping the garrison spread thin, unable to concentrate its strength anywhere. The sound of the assault, the drums and the war cries and the ring of steel on stone, and the screaming of wounded men on both sides, must have been, in the darkness, almost impossible to process. The defenders fought from behind their temporary earthwork fortifications in the breaches, fighting in relays, men stepping back to rest for minutes at a time before stepping forward again. The second wave lasted longer than the first and was beaten back at higher cost, but it was beaten back. Then Giustiniani was wounded. Exactly what happened is unclear. The sources differ on the nature and severity of the wound, some saying a musket ball, others a crossbow bolt, most agreeing that it penetrated through a gap in his armour at the throat or shoulder. It was serious. Whether it was immediately life-threatening, whether it was the kind of wound that could have been bound and kept in the field with sufficient willpower, or whether it was genuinely incapacitating, this has been debated ever since. What is not in dispute is what happened next. Giustiniani asked to be taken from the wall. He called for the key to one of the interior gates, so that he could be carried through to receive treatment in the city behind the fortifications. Constantine came to him, or sent to him, begging him to stay. The accounts vary on this too, some saying the emperor came personally, his voice breaking with urgency, some saying he sent word. Giustiniani left. He was carried through the gate on a stretcher, and the sight of their commander, being removed from the wall on a stretcher, rippled through the Genoese soldiers holding that critical section of the breach at the Lycus Valley. And something changed. A hesitation, a loosening. The iron collective will that had held the breach for 53 nights was suddenly, fractionally, less iron. The Janissaries hit the wall at exactly that moment. The Janissaries were the elite infantry of the Ottoman army, the best trained and most disciplined fighting force in the world at that point in history. Soldiers who had been selected in childhood from the Christian populations of the Balkans and raised within the Ottoman system with absolute dedication to their military function. They were not irregular troops or conscripts. They were professionals of the highest order, and they struck the weakened section of the Lycus Valley with the focused power of a force that had been held in reserve precisely for this moment, rested while the first 2 waves absorbed the defenders' best energies. And somewhere in the smoke and darkness and chaos of that assault, in the confusion created by the withdrawal of Giustiniani and the disarray of the Genoese troops around the breach, a small gate in the interior wall was found unlocked. The Kirka Porta, a small postern gate, a service entrance of sorts, used for night sorties and kept separate from the main defensive system. Whether it had been left unlatched by accident, an extraordinary lapse of discipline at the worst possible moment, or by deliberate treachery, or whether it had simply been missed in the chaos of the evening's preparations, is something that cannot be known. What can be known is what happened when the Janissaries found it. They went through. Within minutes, Ottoman soldiers were on the interior side of the wall, behind the defenders of the breach, in a position from which the defence of that section became not just difficult, but tactically untenable. The cry went up in the darkness. The city has been taken. It spread along the walls and through the streets before anyone could verify it or correct it, running faster than truth can run, because fear moves at a speed that information cannot match. Soldiers who had been holding positions for weeks heard that the city had fallen and began to fall back, and in falling back created the reality that the cry had announced prematurely. The defence, which had held for 53 days against everything the greatest military power of the age could bring against it, collapsed in less than an hour. And Constantine? He was last seen at the walls. He was last seen, according to the accounts of Francis and Barbaro and Tedaldi and Leonard of Chios and the other chroniclers who recorded what they could from where they were in those final hours. He was last seen removing his imperial insignia, the purple cloak, the symbols of office, the marks of the emperor. He took them off and put them aside and picked up his sword and went into the fighting as a soldier, as a man with nothing left to lose except his life, and with no remaining reason to preserve that. His body was never conclusively identified. Among the thousands of dead that lay in and around the fallen walls, in the hours after the battle, no one could point with certainty and say, "There is the last emperor of Rome." His end was absorbed into the chaos of the city's fall, dissolved into the general anonymity of violent death, as if even at the last the city kept him and would not give him back. There are stories. There are always stories when a life ends this way, in ambiguity and chaos and the dark. There are accounts that he was killed in the street fighting as Ottoman soldiers poured through the broken walls. There are later Ottoman claims to have identified his head among trophies presented to Mehmed, though these claims were never verified and may have been politically motivated. There is the story that passed into Greek folklore and survived through 500 years of Ottoman rule, the story that Greek mothers whispered to their children through the long centuries of occupation. That Constantine did not die, but was turned to marble at the moment the city fell, and sleeps beneath the Golden Gate in the Western Wall, waiting for the time that God will send an angel to wake him and give him back his sword and his city. This story is not history, but it is something more than story, in the way that the deepest human needs always produce something more than story. It is what a people does with a grief too immense to be held as mere fact. It is what memory makes of loss when the loss is total and the grief has nowhere else to go except into the imagination, into the dark space beneath a wall, into the form of a sleeping king who will one day return. Mehmed entered Constantinople on the morning of the 29th of May, riding through streets that still held the bodies of the dead and the sounds of a city being stripped. He rode toward the Hagia Sophia. He was 21 years old, and he had done what no one had managed to do in over 1,000 years. At the door of the great church, according to the accounts of those who witnessed it, he dismounted and scooped a handful of earth from the ground and poured it over his own head, an act of ritual humility before God, an acknowledgement that all victories are God's victories and all men, however great, are dust in his sight. Then he went inside. What he felt, standing under that dome, I cannot know. He was complicated enough that what he felt was certainly complicated. Triumph, certainly. But perhaps something else as well, something in the register of awe, of being suddenly in the presence of something so much older and so much more beautiful than anything his ambition had imagined. He was a man who had read history, and he understood what he was standing in. He is reported to have wept. The sources that record this weeping do not agree on the reason. Some attribute it to grief for the city's suffering. Some suggest it was a response to the magnificence of the building, an emotion too large for any other expression. Some later accounts say he recited a Persian poem about the passage of time and the fall of kingdoms, how the spider weaves its web in the palaces of the Caesars, and the owl sings its night song in the towers of Afrasiab. Perhaps he did. It is the kind of thing that a man who read widely and thought deeply might find himself saying in that moment, under that dome, with the light still falling through those 40 windows in the way that it had been falling for 916 years. He ordered the conversion of the Hagia Sophia to a mosque. The Christian imagery on the walls and apse was plastered over, not destroyed, not smashed, but covered, hidden in the dark beneath white plaster, as if the building itself were keeping a secret. The bells were removed from whatever remained of the tower structures. Within days, the call to prayer was being sung from the galleries of the building, where the Orthodox liturgy had been sung for nearly 1,000 years. The language changed, the direction of prayer changed, but the dome remained. The 40 windows remained. The light fell in the same way, through the same windows, onto a floor where different people now prostrated themselves before the same God, with a different name. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople was not simply a military event. It was a geological shift, a change in the landscape of civilization so fundamental that its effects rippled forward through time in ways that are still not fully resolved. The most immediate consequence was the flood of Greek scholars westward into Italy, carrying manuscripts, carrying knowledge, carrying the accumulated intellectual heritage of the Byzantine tradition into a Western Europe that was in the early stages of a cultural transformation that would eventually be called the Renaissance. The connection is not simple or direct, but it is real. The Platonic texts that arrived in Florence in the wake of the fall, the Greek scholars who took up residence in Italian cities and taught the ancient language to a new generation of Western humanists, the manuscripts that ended up in the great Italian libraries, all of this contributed to the ferment of ideas that would reshape European intellectual life over the following century and a half. The fall of the last great guardian of the classical tradition helped, paradoxically, to scatter that tradition across a wider world. The ending was, in this sense, also a beginning. Endings usually are, but something was lost. This needs to be said plainly, without the consolation of those larger patterns, without the comfort of the long view. Something was lost when those walls fell on the morning of the 29th of May, 1453. The thread of a continuous civilization, fragile as it had become, reduced as it was cut. The last living institutional connection to the Roman world, to the world in which the Hagia Sophia had been built as a Christian church, and the serpent column had been brought from Delphi, and the walls had been raised because the city inside them was worth defending. That connection was severed, and with it went a particular way of being in the world, a way of understanding the relationship between human civilization and divine order, between the classical inheritance and the Christian faith, between the East and the West, that had been worked on in that city for 1100 years, and that now existed only in texts and in memory and in the minds of the scholars who had escaped. The city went on. Cities always go on. The Ottoman sultans who succeeded Mehmed invested in Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, though the Greeks continued to call it by its old name for centuries, as if by refusing to use the new name they could preserve something of what the name had meant. The population grew. New mosques and palaces and markets rose above the old streets. The infrastructure of the city was expanded and maintained. Under Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, Istanbul was arguably the most powerful and most beautiful city in the world. The tradition of magnificent architecture that had produced the Hagia Sophia produced, in the Ottoman period, the Blue Mosque and the Topkapi Palace, and Sinan's great structures that still define the city's skyline. The stones of Byzantium are still in Istanbul, layered beneath the Ottoman stones, beneath the stones of the 19th century, beneath the concrete of the 20th, all of it compacted together in the earth of the peninsula. Everything that was ever built there, pressing down on everything below it. I think about those layers often, about the way a city is always a palimpsest, a document written and rewritten over centuries, the old writing still there beneath the new, visible to anyone who knows how to look for it, sometimes surfacing unexpectedly, a section of ancient wall exposed by a construction project, a mosaic discovered beneath the floor of a building, a fragment of inscription emerging from the soil of a garden. Istanbul is full of Byzantium if you know where to look. The Hippodrome, now a public square called the Sultanahmet, still has the shape of the ancient racetrack, the slight curve of the land still reflecting the form of what was there for 1,000 years. The serpent column still stands in it, worn and broken but still there. The Hagia Sophia still stands, still inhabited, still in use. The dome still hangs above the city. The 40 windows still let in the light. George Francis, the man who was with Constantine to the end, who rode with him through the city on that last afternoon, who attended the final ceremony in the Hagia Sophia, and then somehow survived the fall, was captured, enslaved, and eventually ransomed, spent his later years in a monastery on the island of Corfu, writing. He was an old man by the time he finished his chronicle. He had lost his son and daughter in the aftermath of the fall, his son killed by the Ottomans, his daughter taken into the Sultan's harem and dying there. He had lost his emperor, his city, the world in which his entire life had been formed. He wrote his chronicle of the last years of the Byzantine Empire in the quiet of monastic retirement, surrounded by the Ionian Sea and the slow rhythms of monastic life. Years after the events he described, with the particular grief of a man who has outlived everything that made him who he was, and who is trying, through the act of writing, to preserve what memory cannot hold indefinitely. He was under no illusion that writing would restore what was gone. He was a sophisticated enough thinker to understand that words are not the thing itself, that a chronicle is not Constantinople, that describing the last liturgy in the Hagia Sophia is not the same as the liturgy. But he wrote anyway. Because writing is what human beings do when they cannot do anything else. Because the act of bearing witness, of saying, this happened, these people were here, this is what they did, and what they said, and what they chose, is itself a form of refusal, a refusal to let the silence be total, a refusal to let the ending be the only word. He was not the only one. Multiple witnesses, Greek, Italian, Venetian, Spanish, wrote accounts of the siege and fall in the years and decades that followed. They wrote because they felt, with a certainty that comes through clearly across the centuries, that what they had witnessed mattered, that it would matter to people who came after them, that the story of what had been there and what had been lost deserved to be told as accurately and as fully as they could tell it. They were right, it still matters. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is still debated, still studied, still written about by historians and theologians and political scientists and philosophers. The question of what was lost is still asked. The question of what might have been different if the West had sent ships, if Giustiniani had not been wounded, if the Kirko Porta had been locked, if any one of a dozen contingencies had gone another way, is still discussed, because we are still, 5.5 centuries later, living in the world that was shaped by what happened on that morning. The Ottoman Empire that the fall consolidated went on to shape the politics of the Middle East and the Balkans in ways whose consequences are still unfolding. The diffusion of Greek scholarship into the West that the fall accelerated contributed to intellectual developments whose consequences are still unfolding. The religious divisions that the fall both reflected and deepened, between Eastern and Western Christianity, between Islam and Christendom, are still, in various forms, with us. History does not end, it accumulates. Near the end of his account, Francis writes something that I have returned to many times. He writes that on the day before the final assault, the emperor gathered his personal household, the small number of people who had been his companions throughout the long weeks of the siege, people who had served him and known him and been with him in the particular intimacy that crisis creates between human beings who have no one else to turn to. He asked their forgiveness for any wrong he had ever done them, knowingly or unknowingly. He embraced them, he said goodbye. Then he walked out into the last night of the empire he had inherited and could not save, and rode to the walls and did not come back. I do not know what the right way is to hold a story like that. I am not sure there is a right way. It is the story of a man doing what he could with what he had, in the face of something he could not stop, and choosing, at the end, to face it rather than flee it. It is a very small story, in some ways, a single person's decision on a single night in a city that most of the world chose not to defend. And it is an immense story, in other ways, the story of the last inheritor of a civilization at the moment when that civilization finally, after everything it had endured and survived and rebuilt and endured again, came to its end. The dome of the Hagia Sophia still hangs above the city that was once Constantinople. The serpent column still stands in the square that was once the Hippodrome. The great walls still stand in long sections along the western edge of the peninsula, the stone worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, the mortar softened and crumbled in places by the slow work of time and weather, and the roots of plants that have found their way into the gaps between the ancient courses of stone. If you go there, you can put your hand on those stones. You can feel the weight of everything they carry. I think about this often, the question of what we lose when we lose a civilization, and whether the loss is of things or of ways of seeing things, and whether those are the same. When a library burns, what burns is not merely paper and ink. What burns is a particular organization of knowledge, a particular sequence of argument and counter-argument, a particular set of questions that were being asked, and the partial answers that had been found. When an empire ends, what ends is not merely a political arrangement. What ends is a way of understanding the relationship between human beings and the world they inhabit. A set of assumptions about what order is and what it is for and who has the authority to maintain it. These things can sometimes be reconstructed from fragments. They can sometimes be recovered, partially, imperfectly, through archaeology and scholarship and the patient work of reading what survives. But they cannot be fully recovered. The living continuity, the unbroken chain of practice and transmission and argument, one generation teaching the next, the tradition alive in the people who carry it. Once that is cut, What replaces it is always something different, even if it looks similar. The scholars who fled to Italy with their manuscripts brought Greek texts to a Western Europe that was hungry for them. But they brought texts, not the 1100-year conversation that had accumulated around those texts. The conversation was lost. Some things, once they fall, are gone. The manuscripts that burned are gone. The specific living continuity of an empire that had stretched unbroken from Rome to Constantinople across 12 centuries is gone. The particular sound of the Orthodox liturgy rising under that dome, in that specific theological context, in that specific political reality, is gone. These are not recoverable, they do not come back. But the silence that fell on the morning of the 29th of May, 1453, the silence after the bells stopped and the cannon went quiet, that silence is still there, if you know how to listen for it, embedded in the stones of the walls, and in the marble of the floor, and in the plaster that still covers parts of the mosaics, carried forward through the centuries in the grief of a scribe in a monastery on a Greek island who could not stop writing about a man who could not stop fighting for a world that had already, by the time the fighting started, begun to end. There is a particular quality to that kind of silence. It is not empty, it is full of everything that was said and done, and built and loved and argued over and prayed for and lost in the 1100 years before it fell. Full of the chariot races in the hippodrome and the smell of incense in 1,000 churches, and the sound of Greek being read aloud in rooms where it had always been read aloud, and the particular timbre of the Byzantine liturgy rising under that dome in the way it had risen for 9 centuries. Full of the men who patched the breaches in the walls by torchlight and went back to fight in the morning, and the emperor who rode through his city on the last afternoon to say goodbye to it, and the scribe in his monastery on the island who wrote it all down so that we would know. Full, too, of what we have made of it since, of the scholars who came after and tried to understand what was there, of the 500 years of Ottoman history that built something extraordinary on the ruins of what the walls had once enclosed, of the ongoing argument about what a building means and who it belongs to, and what a city's past owes to its present, and sometimes, in the right light, in the particular gold light that still falls through 40 windows in a dome that has hung above the city for 1500 years, in the light that Isidore and Anthemius designed in the 6th century to look like the light of heaven, to make the people inside the building feel that they were standing on the border between the human and the divine. Sometimes in that light, the silence almost speaks, not in words, not in any language that can be transcribed or translated or carried from that place to another, but in the way that certain places speak when they are old enough and have held enough of what human beings have brought to them, in the quality of the air, in the weight of the stone, in the way the light moves across surfaces that have been touched by 10 centuries of hands and 10 centuries of eyes. The dome still hangs, the light still falls, the serpent column still stands in the square below, in the same earth where it was planted 1700 years ago. Constantinople is gone, Istanbul is here, and somewhere between those two names, in the space that history opens between what was and what came after, the story continues. It always continues. That is the one thing history teaches with complete consistency across every civilization and every ending. The story continues. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.